Hey Gervaz,
Hello, Lydia.
how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Can you introduce yourself a little bit for us?
My name is Gervaz Lushaju. I am a photographer. Overall, just doing visual art in general. So I've done some stuff in film, I work in photography. I have some background in clothing design, and I'm also. Uh, to me, sex is an expression of intimacy, of care to another person. It is physically the closest I think you could be with another person. I think the first encounter, I mean, there's always, it's hard to maybe pin it down to one particular place, but there always are like, let's say some of the old films where like people would kiss each other, or a sexual act would be suggested where they don't show the thing, but you kind of get an idea. Of course, early as a kid, you wouldn't know exactly what was going on. Although I did encounter maybe, let's say, more sexually explicit material in secondary school, because there were people who would have like stuff on small devices and stuff, and you'd be like, what are they looking at? And then you'd find out like, oh, it's they're looking at porn or something.
Okay.
Currently, it is, as a person who's basically practicing abstinence, uh, not much. It's more so it plays a I don't know what to call it exactly. Let's say something that tells me, or tells me to have caution, basically. So just something to be wary of, because in urban spaces around young people, it's something that can happen, and not always necessarily with a person you are super intentional about having sex with. So it's just like, okay, something to be wary of, mostly currently, just in terms of how I conduct myself with people I am or would be attracted to.
Okay. Follow-up question. Why is it something that you're wary of?
I'm wary of it. It's something that I'm wary of, particularly because, unlike, so one of the examples I give sometimes is like, if you're trying not to eat food, so you're fasting, you're in a diet, whatever it is, the difference between that and something like abstinence is, uh, with sex, the food also wants to eat you. So basically, you might eat something that you feel like doing. So like you have hunger and you feel like eating, but the food doesn't play much of a role in whether it wants to be eaten or not. But if you encounter someone that you are also, they're also attracted to you. So despite maybe you don't want to sleep with each other at that time, it doesn't take away the fact that both of you want to do it. So it's a harder thing, especially if it's someone you care about. It's harder to say no to them. So in that sense, it's one of those things where, as the space is one of the things about the whole abstinence thing, it's not really so much about not having sex, but more so because by the time you're getting to that point where you have to make that decision not to do it, it's very difficult to do. So usually it's about building a life where you don't find yourself in this position where you have to make that decision, because at that point yours and maybe the other person's bodies have gone so far along that it is very hard for your mind to just overcome, like, oh no, I'm just not going to do it. So it's something to be wary of, where despite you wanting or saying that, hey, I'm not going to do this right now, it you still have to put in a lot of like guardrails to help you from getting to a place where it's much harder to make that decision. So it's something to be wary of, where it's just like, if you let it, it will sort of creep up on you, where you know it's coming. There's sometimes you can see from a mile away, like, yo, if I call this person at this time, if they come by, and if we sit in the space for a bit too long, and we get comfortable, it slowly gets to that point where it's harder and harder to just stop. So in that sense, it's something for me. Well, because I'm trying to do this whole abstinence thing, it's something that I need to be wary of. And it's not sex itself; it's more so like my body, and also there's a term used guarding another person's heart, where I don't want to put another person in a position where they feel like they're in this space where they want to do something and then have to refuse them. So I also have to be wary not to get people in a space where they feel like I'm unnecessarily arousing them, let's say. Yes.
Yeah, like being a tease.
Being a tease. Yes, being a tease is a. And sometimes I feel like we don't. There are people who like the example I use, that there are people by default. There are people who you are attracted to. Everything they do could be attractive to you, could be arousing to you. So someone might not be even trying at all, and you'd find them attractive in that way. So it's so much more important to actively work against it sometimes, because without doing anything, you might be someone just might find you attractive, and it's very easy to step over into being a tease, because you know, like, I don't need to do that much to get this person's attention. I think communication is absolutely necessary for a good sexual relationship, because so even one of the concepts amongst within built in within the whole concept of abstinence and waiting till you're getting married is because if you are trying to be a bit conservative and sort of wait for that one person, as much as you will be somewhat clueless about sex by the time you're having sex, you will have a lifetime with that person to get better at only pleasing that one person's body. So it's like if because people are vastly different in what they like and what they don't like, but if I only had to learn how to do it for at most one person or the minimum number of people, but if I only had to just like, hey, I have to focus on what does this person like, let me learn about their body and what it responds to, and all of a large part of those things come from communicating with that person. Sex in and of itself is a sort of an act of communication, but to have it properly and enhance the experience, you want to know that you are in a space where you're doing the best possible thing for yourself and for the other person. That you're if you're especially if you're doing it from a very selfless place, you want that person to achieve pleasure from it, and you want to know, like, hey, I'm doing the thing that this person likes, and you'd want to communicate your own needs so that they are also in a similar place. Yes. Things about sex that might feel inconvenient or anxiety inducing. I think from the perspective where I am with little to no experience, it's more so I'm concerned that like if I happen, because I'm, as much as I'm practicing abstinence, I know that the person I meet might not be, when I meet them, might not be in the same space up until that point, at least in terms of where they've been before. They might be able to like commit to practicing abstinence until we get married, but before that they may have had several encounters, and I'm worried that I don't know how easy it is to sort of, in a sense, dispel or have someone start relatively afresh. I know you can. It's impossible to unknow what you already know, but I know that I might have to either be patient, or and it will be something that I will already be relatively uninformed about. But being in that space with the other person, where if for some reason that the experiences that they've had has already shaped their sexual expectations, and I would have to be coming in and trying to either accommodate or trying to try the person, help them reset and start afresh with me and be patient with me, and that might be somewhat anxiety inducing, but I think it doesn't bother me as much, because I think sex in of itself, like, it's something that you have for part of a relationship, but ultimately, like, I wouldn't base my relationship entirely on that, and I would want to feel like the loving relationship that we have will help us move slightly towards, or more so towards, accommodating each other on things that would be less than perfect when we meet each other. Sex and intimacy, I do see them as two different things, and one of the things that really made a distinction for me was a thing I came across, and it talked about how the goal of all relationships is intimacy, and it didn't mean sex, and it meant all relationships, not necessarily romantic relationships. And this was the example that I use, is if you go to your local shop again and again and again, and you say hello to the shopkeeper, if you met him somewhere else, or for some unfortunate reason, maybe say you heard he died, you'd feel a little bit bad even if you didn't know him that much. Your sustained interactions over time builds a little bit of intimacy, of just like, oh, this is a familiar face to me. This is someone I know. This is something that I have transactions with, and that's just on a very passing acquaintance. So all other relationships, the more you sustain them and you have multiple interactions, it's building intimacy, some familiarity. So there's intimacy in the sense that breaking down the barrier of someone you don't know. And someone you don't know, that barrier just means it makes the difference between things you'd say to that person that you wouldn't say. It might go from being able to just say hello to someone that you don't know at all, being able to tell them something personal, allowing them to ask you something personal about yourself. So all of that is intimacy. It is how people slowly encroach further and further into that space where they are. They get to know and interact with more and more of you. So in that sense, sex is a different thing. Sex is a to me, it's a version of intimacy. It's an expression of intimacy, one of the expressions of intimacy that is reserved for people who are in a certain kind of relationship. Because if the other thing is, if you're not, there are certain kinds of intimacy where if you don't have a certain relationship with a person, it doesn't translate as well. Like one of the examples, if someone came and just someone you know a little bit came and gave you 1,000,000 shillings, you'd feel some type of way. Like, it's a generous act, but it might be coming from a space in which, like, you're just not that comfortable with that person. It will make you think about, you'll have a lot of questions basically. So similarly, sex is, at least I think it should be, reserved for a certain kind of relationship between two people, for it to be experienced in its fullest. So yeah, in that sense, it's another expression of intimacy, and you can express intimacy various other ways. Some people just they wanna communicate frequently. They want to know about what's going on in your life, and taking the time to put that in is a version of pursuing intimacy. So yeah, it's two different things for me. I don't think there is such a thing as casual sex, in the sense that casual being the term, but it's such a, as I said earlier, sex is a very intimate act. It's the closest you could be with a person physically, and it's hard to do that sort of thing casually. Like, for people who are artists, they have this thing where someone, as a photographer, and someone will come and tell them, like, hey, just come and take a couple of pictures, and they make it sound so casual. But to me, it's a very personal thing that I do. I put myself into that work. I can't just do it. So it's just like, here's just a couple of pictures I took. It's impossible for me to go into it in that mindset. It just naturally, it won't come to me. So that's a relationship that I have with creative work that I do. But with sex, because of its nature, like, I understand why, because it can be messy, it could be all these other things that people might want to put it in that space. Also, sometimes to limit the potential repercussions of having sex, because there's a lot of things that come with it. It's hard. It's unlike an example I would use. It's like a hug. Someone can come and hug you, hold you, let you go, walk away, and it be it just won't register the same way as if you slept with someone. If you had sex with someone, it would just be a totally different experience. It's too big of a thing to be done casually, that even when it is done casually, I think it's not without its repercussions that are not always that great, especially if you are attempting to diminish it. So I think it is not really possible to, we use the term, but it is similar. There are other things that, because of how important they are, because of the potential consequences, even the fact that it is a potentially a life-forming activity, it's very difficult to also just be like, hey, it's just a thing you can do one time, and like, I feel like the term casual does it a disservice. Consent. Consent is kind of complicated. I've been thinking about it a couple different ways recently. Funny enough, I also had a conversation with a person who, and this wasn't necessarily from a perspective of sex, it was from a perspective of someone just asking a person out. And they said no, and this person they said no to them 4 times. And this person is having this conversation while he's holding their baby. So they're married and all that stuff, but like, that line of like, where the line is crossed is a difficult thing to to know, but at the same time, I think it's partially because consent is not necessarily a yes or a no. There are instances in which, if you are a relatively emotionally sensitive person, you can tell when someone is experiencing discomfort and they're just not in the space to say, because as people we're not all the greatest at communicating is something that we don't necessarily learn and become experts at, even when we talk about ourselves, things that are going on in our own heads. And because of that, sometimes people, even if they are not explicitly saying no, at least literally, it doesn't mean they wouldn't want to refuse. And this gray area of consent kind of ruins the discussion, in the sense that there are people who would be like, oh, but you're just supposed to be able to know. And for anyone in that space, even if they asked, it probably wouldn't be enough. And this is partially my argument for having a significant relationship with a person before you have sex with them, because it will give you more time to develop some level of sensitivity towards their no or their yes, or their yes that is hesitant. I wrote a piece that was called I forget what it was called, but it was talking about how people would say yes, but they mean maybe. They just don't want to say the term maybe, or they mean no, but they say maybe. And it's all these things where, like, there's not enough words sometimes to communicate. You're being put in a position where you feel you are pressured to give a yes or a no answer, but neither of those answers are actually what you would want to say, given maybe the time, given if you were in a different space, given if the relationship between you and that person was different. That means, again, it gets chalked up to a lot of how sensitive is that person who's supposed to hear the yes or no is to that individual person's style of communication and the emotional state that they're in and all these things. So consent is an essential part of sex, but I feel like to make it work better, a person would have to really, really lengthen the gap between meeting a person and having sex with them, to reduce the potential pitfalls of consent, in the sense that not everyone can readily communicate their affirmation or denial of a certain thing. I think I'm pretty comfortable. I like to, as much as I can, practice a nearly 100% honesty. So I would say I'm pretty comfortable, because I've done it with a lot of other things that I was initially relatively uncomfortable with, but I've been sort of working against that, getting over the ick of people really, really knowing you. So I think I would be quite okay. I think, to a degree, I think I know that something that would, and maybe this is, I do a lot of things that have a very sort of selfless, not in the altruistic way necessarily, it's just I don't really care sometimes when I'm the person who has to be the sort of giver in a relationship. I can do a lot of things without expecting a lot of reciprocity from people. I'm okay with them not being necessarily always in the space to do things for me, but it does give me pleasure for someone to be able to have a good time and enjoy themselves. So I think the pleasure of my partner would be something that would give me pleasure, to know or to see that they are having a certain experience and enjoying themselves. I think that would give me pleasure. How I look naked. No, well, I like to be fit. Like, I would like to be more fit than I am now. But I'm also very just like I'll look at myself and be like, "You're all right." Like, the one of my favorite references about this was a comedian named Pete Holmes, and he's very tall and he's a bit wide in the middle. This is his own description of himself, and he's just like, it fascinates him that someone out there finds that attractive. Like, even if it's like, this, my body looks weird, but I'm just like, this is exactly what, like, someone's like, that's my jam. So I'm just like, well, to me it doesn't really matter. Like, I think about how I look in terms of like, oh, I'd like to be fit, but also more from a health perspective. But I don't worry about my self perception or my potential perception of someone else finding me attractive or attractiveness in that sense, because I'm like, someone out there, for reasons that they or even myself would not be able to explain, would probably find me attractive. So I'm all good.
Cool. Do you have any sexual insecurities?
I think it would just be the one where you had the previous question where I was talking about, if I meet someone in the future and based on their previous experience that I would have to deal with something, or live up to something for that matter, that I have no framework of understanding. Like, I know I could probably get there with time, but I think it might be something that might take time to acclimate to. I'd like to think I'd be as accommodating as possible, but it's one of those things that I feel like just until you get there, you won't absolutely know. I believe that people should wait to get married to have sex. And I also acknowledge that on some level it seems like a very either restrictive or lofty ideal. But at the same time, there is a problem with some of the nature of the way some of us choose to conduct our lives could potentially be problematic to the weaker person, or the I don't know what term to use, someone who just doesn't know, the more naive of us. So if I were to think of a principle that at its core was just meant to protect the most naive, or the weaker person in a larger society, which is some of what the rules are when you go by some roads and it says somewhere don't cross here, and you might be a fairly intelligent person and be like, who would think to cross here? This seems so obvious. But the rule isn't made necessarily for people like you. It's made for people who might not think that way. And so similarly, even because this whole idea, it repeats itself in certain religions, it repeats itself in just certain cultural norms. But ultimately, I think it is about protecting people from potentially being emotionally or sometimes even physically harmed by trying it out otherwise. Because we live in an imperfect society, people are not perfect, and there's a lot of things that go down and a lot of hurt that happens in that space. And I think, as counterintuitive as it may seem, it really does help. And on one end, one of the biggest things for me, just as a man, practicing abstinence it's about sexual discipline. So to some degree, there is no you have to learn sexual discipline as a man. Like, there's just no alternative. Like, if you don't do it at some point in your life, even if you do get married, if you haven't learned sexual discipline, you can stray from your marriage vow, and you can cheat on your partner. Even if you're not married, but you don't have any sexual discipline, it's easy to be swept either one way or the other by the next available sexual conquest. There are people who are ready and willing, and they don't care about you being married or being in some kind of relationship or whatever it is. It is really just up entirely to you and your own discipline to keep yourself in check. So what abstinence does is that during the time when you're young and whatever, and you could have sex, it's a bit like fasting. What you're just trying to develop is control, to try and have control, so that if you, and it doesn't really end once you get married. Even amongst Christians, sometimes we talk about it in the sense like, oh, I'm going to wait till I get married, and then when I get married I'll be good. But even once you get married, I was talking to a friend of mine. He's like 60, I think, at this point, and he was saying like, oh, I thought that, once I got married, I wouldn't have to deal with, like, other women coming, and because, like, I'm married now. He says it didn't stop, and then he thought like, oh, but once I'm 50, 60, like, I'm an old man, no one's gonna try and make moves at me. And he's just like, it's still happening. There are still people who will come for you, and if you haven't you haven't trained yourself in some kind of sexual discipline, there's a lot of opportunities to just to go out there and sleep with whoever you want, regardless of anything. So in that sense, I really think people should wait, and not just wait in the sense of like, I'm just holding back, so when I get married I'll let the gates loose on my partner or whatever it is you just need to develop sexual discipline. You have to be able to control yourself to make your body basically listen to you and not to be a slave to it. Sex was not discussed in my family growing up. Like, I think the closest thing my dad specifically, my mom not at all, has ever said to me was just like, be careful out there, there are diseases. Or some generic two sentences probably like that. And that was about it. I think a lot of it, there was a lot of upbringing around stuff that helped me navigate that area initially, but there were no conversations. Not really, no. Culture has, by and large, influenced how I engage. So there's of course my spiritual leanings with the whole practicing abstinence thing, but I think also culture has sort of now culture is a very broad term, and maybe to clarify, I'm talking about sort of global, semi-internet culture in that space, not strictly Tanzanian culture, because I think that has a larger influence, especially in urban spaces. And I think what it has done, it has created this dynamic in which sex isn't just the act. So there's this large spectrum that has come from things that are sex adjacent. So things being sold to you, even with its music, even being like having sexual explicitness and being just out there and being mainstream, all these things have made it so that you might not, the distance between you and act, like, let's say, penetration sexual activity, is there's this large spectrum in the middle. And in the sense that if you're even avoiding engaging in sex, the things you'd have to avoid are much more extensive. Or if you are picking up on the potential of having sex with someone, there could be a lot of things happening in between to all the way there, that because those things have permeated into culture more, then they have affected, by and large, how people engage in sex, how people ask for it, how available it is compared to. So even the fact that I don't know how long, because they say prostitution has been around the world a long time, but to a degree, there's certain spaces where you go and it's out there and like no one bats an eye. So people are confident enough to stop their cars, talk to someone, pick them up, and go. So all of those things, again, they are essentially at that point part of culture because they're happening and no one is being surprised. So by that, in that respect, I'm like, okay, as a person who is trying to live a certain life, it means the things and situations I might have to avoid are different than, I'm assuming, maybe at a different time. This is going to be a hard question to repeat before. I think there's this thing that is happening, and in certain African cultures. And as much as you have sex in music, maybe even in film and in other parts of the arts, and we don't talk about it as much, is when it comes to, like, in those spaces, in the spaces of arts and music and all these things, it's one of those things where, one, it is directed to a large, it's not a personal interaction. It's not one person sitting in a room and singing this thing to another person. It's out there. So it's in a space of a lot of people. You don't have to confront the issue head on. No one basically does. So it isn't as difficult to sort of tolerate. And what is happening, I think, in my opinion, with the music and the arts is that because we don't have, there's this idea that we have this thing we call Tanzanian culture, for example, but I don't really believe it exists because we're just made up of so many different tribes and all these things. And so because of that, there is no primary voice to say this thing is acceptable in this culture and this is not. That we don't have a lot of control mechanisms. So what happens is, because things like music and arts, they're popular, they're loud and they're visible, they form basically what becomes acceptable in culture, so long as no one comes in and says, no, we can't do that anymore. Actually, one of the things that I found quite unfortunate was, for a time, there's a certain kind of dance, let's say, but it's basically like erotic dance or stripping in some respects, where people would wear very like light fabrics, and they'll twerk essentially and have water poured on them. And it was happening, and it seemed very counterintuitive to what seemed like a conservative culture. But it took several years until there was a sort of official position on, like, oh, we don't do that. Like, that thing is banned. But up until that point, it was going on, and it was public knowledge. It had been in newspapers, so it wasn't like it wasn't an underground thing per se. So there is a that sense of, like, there are things that happen because no one is there to speak into culture and be like, maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe exposing young children to this kind of music or certain kinds of things is a bad idea. But at the same time, because we on the one-to-one level of father talking to son or mother to daughter, all these things, we have moved away from tribal structures or traditional structures where they'll have my dad would tell me, like, oh, if you were in our village, I would have cut off a plot of land, given it to you, and we would have married you off to someone, and you would have had all these things that you get put through as you head towards your marriage, and the same thing for the young lady. But we, because of moving and living in these sort of urban and semi-urban spaces, we don't have any of that anymore. But we also don't have anything to replace it. So essentially, everyone just gets their information from wherever they get the information. If you saw something in a movie, if you read something on the internet, it just happens that way. And it put our parents in a difficult place, because I think they've always sort of been in a position where they didn't really talk about these things. But in small societies, there is someone assigned to talk about those things, and your child or your children will go through the process, and at least it would happen in some form or fashion. But now everyone is sort of like, figure it out on your own, because your parent also doesn't want to be the one to sit you down and have that awkward talk. To just be like, okay, so long as you're not doing anything disrespectful, for lack of a better term, to them, or at least in their vicinity or where they could see it, they'll be like, okay, you're fine. If they found out about something, they might be like, hey, you shouldn't do that. But there is no structure to sort of even just passing on those morals and those ideas. We've sort of lost that because we don't have a formal replacement, nor did we formalize it in the past. And a lot of African tradition is it's oral tradition. It's passed on that way. And if no one says anything, history is not lost. It's just forgotten, basically. The agency of women in terms of their sexual experiences, I'm not really sure, and I'm not really sure in the sense that there are things that have happened. So even in the, like, statistically, the onset of the, I think it was birth control, has changed a lot of things. There are definitely things that have happened, and because of changes in culture, where people, especially in urban spaces, so this might be a microcosm of culture, because urban spaces are not the majority of spaces even in this country. They're actually a small group of people, but this is where we operate a lot. But in that respect, people in urban spaces are more confident about giving and or like sexual intimacy, giving or receiving it. It's much more publicized. So I think, yes, in a sense that they I would say maybe they have the opportunity to do so. So whether they are or they don't, I think is kind of subjective. But I would say the opportunity to do so and feel less associated with less shame or shaming, because you're not living in an example actually I've been giving recently is because shame of its nature used to be one of the deterrents from people doing things they shouldn't, especially in small society. So you're not going to go and run off with someone's daughter as a dude, because you're living in small communities and they know you and they know your neighbors and stuff like that. But if I live in an apartment and I know none of my neighbors, I can do essentially whatever, and, like, I don't have to answer to anyone. So there's a lot of people living that way in urban spaces, because unless it's your parents, like I said, immediately seeing what you're doing, there is no one there to immediately be like, no, you can't do that. You have the independence to do that. If you're making a certain income, you're not dependent on anyone for that income. That means you make your own choices, and you know that on some level that if there are certain consequences, financial, economic type consequences, you can deal with them. So I would say yes. The thing about sex that I wish I had been taught is almost, given that there was nearly zero or basically zero input on that, and nearly anything at all I think would have made a difference, especially from a non-functional perspective. So sometimes people will just talk about, like, especially for girls, just tell like you get pregnant, like it leads to having children. But that isn't the thing, that isn't the surprise about sex. The surprise about sex sometimes is just your own hankering for it, in terms of just like your libido, your appetite for it, and then preempting your appetite so you have some chance of control. Because I absolutely know several people who it surprised them. So they sort of went down that path, and sometimes it doesn't always. It's for some people it even manifests just in an addiction to porn, where it's just like there's this thing, but if you're given regular access to it by and large, it can become too much. It can become addictive. So something like even a little bit of information on that end concerning appetites would have helped you ease into it. It's a bit like someone who does a drug and does a lot of it. They'd be the first time for some reason, but they become addicted. But they even may have been introduced to it by someone who they've developed control already, or they're just like, oh, I can do this and I cannot be overwhelmed by it. So that telling someone about the feelings, the euphoria and the appetite and all that, I think is something that would have made, even for me, a difference. Where just like, oh, there's things I would have not wanted to have experienced or just found out by reading, not necessarily reading, or just hearing people talk about them, because people talk about them sometimes in very crude ways, and it's a great thing, but depending on where you hear about it, it could be made to seem ugly. Yeah. I don't think we have a sexual curriculum at all. I think we have something that talks about biology, maybe the biology of reproduction. That's literally, I think, even in the course of learning about reproduction, I don't think the word sex was ever mentioned, and it probably needs to be a parallel curriculum separate from all the biological stuff, because you're learning about anatomy. I remember talking to someone who said like they'd seen a diagram of female genitals and they didn't know what it was. They had learned how to draw it and label it, and they didn't know what it was. They didn't know on what part of the body it was. They just no idea, because it was a very like structural, technical learning that wasn't really talking about certain practicalities. So I think there's a lot of lacking there, and there's a lot of misinformation, because again, in music and in a globalized society with the internet, there's a lot of information floating about, and it's having a formal sort of place where someone can learn at least a couple of things, and then once they hear other information, be able to weigh it out against that, would make a large difference. So I feel like it is dangerously insufficient, because there are people who are, the voices that are not necessarily the best are currently louder than anything else, especially by role models who in of themselves don't do the best. Like if you have someone who's sort of famous and rich and having a lot of sexual relationships, lending that narrative to what it's like to have sex and how you get it and what you do and all those things, it creates a very dangerous dynamic for young men, because they will just have like, oh, so this is what it's like, or if this is great, let me pursue that exact kind of lifestyle. And it's unfortunate, because we did have a point even in music where people would talk about like, I'm going to find this girl, I'm going to take her to my mother, but you don't have a lot of music like that anymore. Yeah. The porn industry, as an industry, I think it's just, I was going to say a bad thing, but I'll change it. I'll say I think it's an evil thing, because it does require, on some level, the reduction of someone's being or body, for that matter, into an object purely for someone else's pleasure. And there's a lot of it's one of those. So I have a friend who is a sort of a nudist, And now we're talking to them about like, oh, if they wanted to start their own nudist colony and what that would look like. If their ideal world would be like people being in their natural state. And I told them like, okay, how would you guarantee that absolutely no one at that space was sexually assaulted or abused? And ultimately they had no answer. Like without violating other privacies, whether it's putting cameras everywhere, whatever it is, there was no answer to give where like there's no way that they could guarantee people would be safe. And it's one of those industries where it is very difficult to guarantee that anyone participating is absolutely, especially if you're a consumer. So from the not even you're a videographer or producer or whatever for porn, if you're on the consumer end, it's very hard to guarantee that someone in that space is not in that space 100% willingly or being positive about being in that space. That aside, it also does this thing where it shapes the minds of people and approaches to sex. And this is basically the opposite of what I talked about when I was talking about abstinence, where if the idea was like, oh, you want to figure out how to please someone, just find the someone and figure out how to please them, and then just work on what they want. Don't find another idea that you encountered somewhere and try and graft it onto this thing because it's just like, oh, there's this thing I like because I saw it somewhere and it aroused me. But there's actually a phrase about, it's about widows, and where the new wife says you can never compete with a dead woman. Like no matter what you do, that person's dead wife, you can't compete with them. And you can't compete with a woman somewhere on screen who is getting paid to do certain things. It will create this dynamic where if you want to transplant that into real life, the other person on the other end of that, you will be treating them very unfairly. It is better if you're trying to have a healthy sexual encounter, having preconceived notions is a very dangerous thing for both of you, because you might get disappointed by a fantasy that might or might not be able to be lived up to. But also thinking about the other person, they of course, if they care about you, let's say, they wouldn't want to disappoint you, but it would also get fuzzy with things even like consent, where someone's just like, they've consented to have sex with you, but amongst the layers of consent, what have they consented to do? What does having sex with you entail, and what are they comfortable doing? And are they just doing something because they want to indulge you as their partner? So just as a concept, I think it's a bad thing. I wish it didn't exist. But it's one of those things where it's like fast food. Like it will be there and it will be popular because there's people who have it's feeding a certain appetite. But in that space, more often than not, it will go overboard. Somewhere down, like I was listening to something about the dark web. It was a documentary, and part of the dark web is dedicated to sexual appetites of people who normally cannot be easily accepted into society. But that means that someone has to make that content and has to involve people who probably shouldn't be making that content, either because they're children or whatever it is. But again, that the idea of pornography there are people who treat it as a certain kind of porn as being okay, but it's one of those things where it's impossible to draw a line. There is no place where you'd be like, oh, just stop right here and this is the right amount of acceptable pornography, for that matter. So I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a bad concept to exist in society, but it's just like with capitalism, where anything that can be sold will be sold. Anything that can be bought will be sold. We are unfortunately now doing it to people. Yeah.
Okay. We've reached the end. Thank you so much, Gervaz.
Thank you.